Well, hey, everybody, and welcome to the Crossway podcast. My name is Josh, and today on the podcast, I just wanted to do a little bit of a follow-up from this past Sunday's message. We started a brand new series this week called The Unsettling Solution for Just About Everything. And if you missed that service, you can check it out on our YouTube channel or on our Facebook page in the archives there. But really the main point that our lead pastor, TJ, made during this kickoff for this series was that grace is the unsettling solution for just about everything. And what I wanted to follow up on in his message was at the very beginning, he mentioned something about us as Christians balancing grace and truth. And he alluded to the fact that we actually do this pretty poorly, which I would agree with. But I wanted to talk a little bit about that and maybe look at some of the lessons that we can learn from the life of Jesus and how we as Christians can balance grace with truth. Now, when we say balancing grace with truth, it immediately sounds like those two things are opposed to one another, at least if not indirectly, directly. But I don't think that that is true. Grace is not the opposite of truth, right? The opposite of grace is, just desserts or just punishment, right? And so they're not directly opposed to one another in the sense of that you can't have one and have the other, or that they're somehow opposite ends of the spectrum, right? I mean, you need truth to even recognize the need for grace, right? You can't recognize that something is gracious or grace is merciful unless, of course, you see that there is mercy undeserved, right? Or that there is a lack of just punishment that is truly deserved, but that's not what you're getting, or something like that. And so I wanted to talk about the balancing act that TJ alluded to for us and what that actually looks like for us. I think that the balancing act that we as Christians have in dealing with grace and with truth is really on how we handle and deal with truth, right? It's what we decide to do with truth. And I think that Jesus' whole and in his entire ministry was a demonstration for us of what it looks like to be gracious and to be truthful all at the same time. And that was part of what Jesus, or what TJ was saying in this message that we kicked off for this past week, that Jesus was 100% grace and 100% truth. And so I want to look at the life of Jesus and just kind of go over some points, I think, of how we can take the things that he did and apply it to our lives, adopt some of his methods and the strategies that he used in order to not compromise on the truth, but be gracious with people, and to not only be gracious with people, but to offer them the same grace that if you're a Christian, you have become a recipient of. And so the first thing I want to notice and acknowledge about Jesus' life and the way that he handled his dealings with people and the way he handled his dealings with sin is that Jesus didn't condemn people. Jesus was not a condemner. And now right off the bat, I want to make a distinction that I think a lot of times people just get wrong. And that is this distinction. Condemnation or condemning something is not the same as recognizing or acknowledging something. Right? So condemning sin is not the same thing as acknowledging or recognizing sin, either in your own life or somebody else's. Condemnation, especially as it's used in the New Testament, the term condemnation typically has a connotation of sentencing to punishment, right? So it's more akin to like a legal pronouncement of guilt and sentencing. Right? And so this is the lack of condemnation that I'm talking about that Jesus had. He didn't sentence people to punishment. In fact, this is the opposite of what he came to do, right? He came to offer a not guilty verdict for people who actually deserved such a verdict. And I want to read in John chapter 8, verses 9 to 11. And this is a story that TJ actually told in his message this past Sunday. It's the story of the woman who was caught in adultery. And I want to read the words of Jesus and examine them a little bit when it comes to this concept of condemning people. And so in John chapter 8, verses 9 through 11, this is right after the group of people had brought this woman before Jesus, and they were saying that she should be stoned. And then Jesus, like TJ had mentioned, began to write in the sand and basically said, those of you without sin, cast the first stone. In other words, those of you without sin, you are allowed to condemn this woman. You are the ones who are able to do that. And this was their response. It picks up in verse 9. It says, "At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. And Jesus straightened up and asked her, 'Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?'" And the Greek word for condemn here is actually katakrino, and it carries this sentence to punishment connotation like we talked about earlier. And she replied, no one, sir, no one has condemned me. And then Jesus replied with this answer, "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." So here we can see a clear instance where Jesus deals with sin and a person who is in a state of sin with grace, right? Jesus says, "I do not condemn you." Now, notice that does not mean he did not acknowledge her sin, right? The very last thing he says to her is, "Go and leave your life of sin." And TJ was making this point also. And so I want you to notice and pay attention to the difference here between condemnation and acknowledgement or recognition or something like that. Those are not the same thing. It's not a flaw in this instance for Jesus to recognize and acknowledge the sin that the woman was committing. But that's not equal to condemnation. Jesus didn't sentence this woman to the punishment that she deserved. I want to read out of John chapter 3, verses 17, which comes right after John 3:16, which almost all of us, even if we're not Christians, are probably familiar with. And in 17 through 18, it says, "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe stands condemned already, because they've not believed in the name of God's one and only Son." So, just to be clear, there is condemnation for sin, right? But it's that truth. It's the truth about our being condemned and standing condemned before God that exemplifies the grace and the mercy of Jesus, of the person of Jesus, right? Jesus's whole ministry was one of coming down to show us that we're condemned, in order that the grace of his death and resurrection from on the cross was an immense form of grace. So I think a lesson that we can learn, the first lesson that we can learn from the life of Jesus and the way that he handled sin and the way that he dealt with other people, was that he didn't condemn them. And the condemnation of sin is not our responsibility, right? That responsibility belongs solely to God. And even though it does, we can see how he handled it, right? He sent Jesus in order to pay the penalty for us. And so when we interact with other people and we see and acknowledge sin in other people's lives and in our own life, we shouldn't approach this from a point of view of condemnation, because not only is that inappropriate for us, but it's also unhelpful. We should be approaching this from the point of view of grace. And that really leads to the second point that we can learn from Jesus' life, which is that he was completely others-focused in the way that he interacted with people. Right? Jesus was completely focused on other people. His ministry was one, like I said earlier, of making people aware of their sin and their condemnation. But the purpose behind that was to help them acknowledge and be ready to receive the grace that he was about to offer, right? The point of everything that he did was for their benefit, even when he was pointing out truths about their condemnation before God and their need for the mercy that he came to offer. And so even when it felt like Jesus was being really harsh with people, he was actually still being very others-centric, right? I want to read to you a couple examples of this so that you can fully grasp what's going on here. So in Matthew chapter 19, this is the story about Jesus interacting with the rich man. So the rich man comes to Jesus, and he basically says, "What must I do to enter the kingdom of heaven?" And then Jesus gives him a list of some commandments and laws that he should be keeping in order to be perfect. And the man responds, we'll just pick up actually right where the man responds to what Jesus says about keeping the commandments. And the man says, "All these I have kept," the young man said. "What do I still lack?" And Jesus answered, "If you want to be perfected, go sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you'll have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me." But when the young man heard this, he went away sad because he had great wealth. And then Jesus said to his disciples, "Truly I tell you, it's hard for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I tell you, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God." And when the disciples heard this, they were greatly astonished and asked, "Who then can be saved?" And Jesus looked at them and said, "With man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible." And so here you can see Jesus sort of elevating the standard, right? It's almost like, a lot of times we view Jesus, rightfully so, as this ambassador of kindness and grace and the extender of that. But part of what makes that grace so attractive and so part of what makes us able to recognize the weightiness of the grace that Jesus brings to the table is the realization of how much it is needed, right? And this is exactly what Jesus' ministry was doing. He was an arbiter of grace by showing you how much you need it. You can see this earlier in Matthew in chapter 5 where he's talking about the Jewish law, and people, there are lots of people who will be, I have kept the law, and they saw themselves righteous in their own eyes, and Jesus came to just obliterate that view, right? So in Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 22, Jesus says, "You've heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'You shall not murder,' and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment." And then a few verses later, in verse 27, he says, "You've heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." And so Jesus, all throughout his ministry, Jesus is elevating the law. Right? A lot of times we think Jesus came and he did away with the law. Really, a lot of what Jesus' ministry was him coming and setting the law on a higher level, basically meeting people who thought that they had accomplished what the law required and saying, "You haven't. You haven't accomplished what the law actually requires. And so you also, who think that you are righteous and think that you stand before God blameless, you also are in need of the grace that I have come to offer. And so Jesus helped people identify their need for grace so that they would be ready and able to accept it. And so even when it seemed like Jesus was being harsh, his focus was others-centric, right? Jesus was letting people know that they needed what he came to offer them, and he was magnifying the very nature of what it is that he was offering them. And so that's something else that we can learn. Jesus, no matter what he did, and even when it seemed like he was being harsh or setting the standards so high, all of that was for the purpose of those people. It was to allow them to see that they needed what he had to offer, and not only see that they needed it, but to allow them and give them the ability to accept it. And all of these things, Jesus's lack of condemnation for people and his others-focused ministry was tied up in a package of gentleness. Right? Jesus was a kind and tender. He had a tender spirit, and his general disposition towards those who needed what he had to offer, which is everybody, as part of his ministry was seeking to show. His general disposition was one of tenderness and kindness, and an extension, an invitation to participate in what he had to offer them, which is reconciliation to God. He was going to bear the penalty. He was going to bear himself the condemnation that everybody deserves. And really the whole story of Jesus' death and resurrection of Jesus is a story of divine gentleness, right? Only God has the proper authority to condemn people for their sin against him. And Jesus was making that very clear. Whether or not you think that you have done this, you are guilty before God. If you have even lusted after another woman in your heart, you have sinned against God and you stand condemned before him. But the whole story of Jesus coming to earth to die on the cross for our sins and to be resurrected is a story of divine gentleness. Instead of God giving us what we deserve, he is tender with us. He's gentle with us, not only bearing the penalty himself, right? But by actually coming to earth and starting a huge ministry of people to make that known, right? Like the whole idea of the church and the whole idea of Christian discipleship is a story of God being gentle with humanity. And you and I, if you're a Christian, we are able to participate in that gentleness with God. And so this should be a mark of our life in interacting with other people, right? Jesus' spirit in ministry is the image of God's perfect holiness, right? That's what it all encompasses. God is both completely just, and he is both completely merciful and gracious. And he has organized a way to enact both of those things in a way that treats us with such love and tenderheartedness. And so if we want to be better about persuading and offering the grace that we have received, if we're Christians, if we want to be better about persuading others to receive that grace as well, all while affirming and exalting the truth, we should look at Jesus and emulate what he did. Because he did this, like TJ said in the message, to perfection. And so we don't seek the condemnation of other people in our interaction with them, right? Instead, we seek their best interest and their ultimate good, which is found in the grace that not that we can offer, but that God has offered to everybody. And we now, as Christians, are bearers of that, right? If you're a Christian, you're not only a bearer, you're not only a recipient of the grace that God has offered to us, but you're a bearer of that good news, right? And the reason that Jesus has not come back for you yet is because you have a part to play in helping as many people as possible become recipients of that, right? This is what Peter tells the church when they were anxiously awaiting Christ's return. And he says, God is patient with you, and he wants as many people as possible to come into relationship with him. And if you're a Christian, you have a part to play in extending the grace of God that was extended to you to other people. And so this means your life, like Jesus's, should revolve completely around others, right? You are here for other people, right? Obviously, there's development and growth that's going to happen in your life as you grow closer to God and you allow his Holy Spirit to become more influential in your life. But the sole purpose why Jesus has not come yet, at least is what it seems from the words of Peter, is because you and the church have a role to play in being completely others-focused and extending the grace of God that Jesus came to extend for all of us to as many people as possible. And so we're not here to condemn other people. We're not here to judge them. That's only God's role, and he has decided to offer them grace. And so we can live a life that's completely others-focused and adopt a spirit of gentleness and kindness so that other people are going to be able to see the things that we've just talked about, right? they'll be able to see that we actually do care, and that we aren't condemning them, and that the reason why grace is so powerful is because it is so necessary. And that's really the role that truth has to play in our interaction with people. It allows people to see how necessary the grace of God is for their lives, and it allows people to see the magnitude of that grace and the attractiveness of it. And so when we interact with other people, our goal should be to help them find fulfillment, because if we're a Christian and we have responded in faith to the grace offered in the death of Jesus, then we know from our own experience just how amazing that is, and how undeserved and how large the debt that's been paid is for us. And we want to help other people see that and accept it and find that fulfillment also. Well, thanks, guys, for listening. And if you are interested in hearing more of these podcasts that we've got, you can go to our website, or you can go to YouTube channel, Facebook page, the Church Center app, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, any of your favorite streaming platforms. You can find them there. Thanks, guys, and I will see you next week.